This should have been done by all of the presidents that preceded me, and they all know it. Some of them have told me that we should have done it.
Which former presidents told President Trump, as he said, that he should have built a wall? All their representatives have denied that that was the case.
Well, I know the president has said that that was his impression from previous administrations, previous presidents. I know I've seen clips of previous presidents talking about the importance of border security, the importance of addressing the issue of illegal immigration.
That's different from telling the president, though, right?
But look, you know, honestly, the American people want us to address this issue.
What issue? Which one? Mike Barnicle, what's going on with Vice President Mike Pence? Help me out here.
That was pretty definitive, Mika. I mean, clearly he answered the question that we all had in mind. Did Donald Trump, was he talking to James K. Polk in his dreams, or the president of Home Depot at some point in the past? We don't know. But I mean, this particular, another, you know, fallacy, lie, call it what you will, coming from the president of the United States and leaving it to Mike Pence to clean up the mess, something that Mike Pence was clearly unable to do.
Yeah. Okay. It's just hard to watch. Joining us now, founding president of Voto Latino and an MSNBC contributor, Maria Teresa Kumar. Former Republican Congressman Ryan Costello of Pennsylvania is with us, and former chief of staff to the DCCC and a former director of strategic communications for Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign, Adrienne Elrod, is with us. She's the president of Elrod Strategies. And Casey Hunt is back with us as well. Maria, well, I'll start with this op-ed from the New York Times. It's entitled The Crisis in the Oval Office. The New York Times editorial board writes this morning, the president has exaggerated threats, but ignored the hazards that his border policies created. And they write in part this: how fitting is it that President Trump's first Oval Office address was aimed at stirring up the American public about a crisis largely of his own making? While Mr. Trump proved a wily campaigner and political street fighter, as president, he's been painfully out of his element. 2 years in, he remains ill-suited to the complicated, thankless, often grinding work of leading the nation. He prefers grandstanding to negotiating, and he continues to have trouble with the whole concept of checks and balances. While the Republican base remains enamored of him, most of the electorate has grown weary of his outrages and antics, which is why, with his wall on the line, Mr. Trump so desperately needs to convince the American people that they are facing an acute crisis, maybe even a bona fide emergency. Shutting down the government is only the most recent effort at getting what he wants by traumatizing the nation he has sworn to serve. Maria Teresa Kumar, I want to start with you just on a very basic human level. What was it like watching the president talk last night about this crisis?
It was hard to watch because that Oval Office should be used for real emergencies. Presidents have used it when they had to declare a state of emergency after 9/11, when we've had to talk about Hurricane Katrina, when lives and human lives were on the line and our national security were at threat. It's also been, the Oval Office, Mika, has also been used to uplift Americans and to remind us what makes us strong. And yesterday, the president went toe-to-toe with the basic DNA of our Americanness, this idea that we are kind, we are generous, that we have immigrant roots, and that our DNA is based on these factors. Sadly, what he was talking about was precisely what he has created. The emergency that we have on the border is a humanitarian crisis, largely to his making. In fact, Mika, he shuttered a program that President Obama created in 2014 as a result of the crisis at the border, when we had 70,000 people trying to rush in because of the instability in Central America. He created a program called Central American Minors. Well, folks from minors from Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras did not have to make a treacherous journey that the president mentioned yesterday, and instead could present themselves at U.S. embassies and seek asylum. President Trump, last year, he shuttered that program in January. 4 months later, we see 2,000 young people coming in with mothers trying to seek shelter. He has shuttered the ports of entry. He tear gasses innocent people and forces them to find other ways so that they can seek asylum. And let's not forget, Asylum is completely legal. The moment you come to our borders, you're allowed to seek asylum. A judge basically told him that he could not prevent asylum seekers. So what did he do? He closed it and made it more difficult. So people all of a sudden are on the line. Under his watch, we've had 2 young deaths and no accountability. What he should have used his platform yesterday was to say how he was actually going to address the problems at Homeland Security and how he was going to get American workers, 800,000 federal workers, back to work.
Ryan Costello, you've been out of office for only, 6 days now after serving a couple of terms as a Republican out of Pennsylvania. Help us understand how this ends, how this comes to a head. As somebody who just left that body, President Trump, we should remind people, about a month ago was reported to be ready to walk away from the idea of the wall. And when that went public, he heard from people like Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity and members of his base saying, hey, that was the central promise of your campaign. And now here we are with the president not willing to move off his demand for $5.7 billion for a physical wall at the border. What breaks this fever? How do we get past it?
He's really backed himself into a corner. I think Republican members of Congress at this moment in time are really growing weary of the juxtaposition between a wall and keeping the government closed. And I think Democrats have become very emboldened by this. I do not see a scenario where the president says, you know what, I give up on the wall. My best guess is that this shutdown continues unless and until the president decides he's going to go the emergency declaration route. Because I don't think Democrats are going to concede anything here. I don't think that they have to. I think, to quote an old Aerosmith song, it's kind of the same old song and dance at this point. And in the process, I don't think that the president has enhanced his position or argument with the American public that somehow it's worth shutting down the government for a border wall.
So a new poll finds, Adrian, that President Trump is losing some ground with the American public over the shutdown. It's a new Reuters Ipsos poll asking who is to blame for the shutdown, and it finds 51% of Americans, a majority now, say the president is to blame. That's up 4 points from the shutdown's first week, while those blaming Democrats dropped by a point. Another 7% blame congressional Republicans. I mean, let's just take a step back. This is insane. I mean, the president of the United States is willing to keep the government shut down because he wants to deliver on a chant he led at rallies in 2015, in 2016, while running against your candidate, Hillary Clinton. To Ryan's point, the only way out he sees is a national emergency. If you're a Democrat, you have no incentive to give any ground on this. What do you see as the way out of it?
You don't, and I think you bring up a really smart point, Willie, on looking at that poll, which does show that this is on Trump, and the American people, the majority of American people are seeing that President Trump is responsible for this. They are giving him the blame. So Democrats, to that point, have little incentive to cooperate on this, especially when we know that $5.7 billion for a concrete wall is absurd. It's not going to cause, it's not going to help anything. It's going to be ineffective. At the same time, however, I do think Democrats potentially run the risk of not appearing that they care about border security. They do, and Leader Pelosi and Leader Schumer have made it very clear that we will compromise on some sort of border security funding because we do have not necessarily a national security crisis at the border, but we do have a humanitarian crisis, as Leader Pelosi said last night. So Democrats need to make sure that they don't look like they do not care about border security.
Yeah, and Adrian, I think this is, one of those moments where sometimes the situation is so ridiculous that, the Democrats could hold the power in their hands to hold Trump accountable for what he's saying and not give him the money, the irresponsible money to spend on this wall. But what are the risks and the pitfalls as they move forward and how they handle this situation?
Well, we do know that, Mika, the most important issue, the wedge issue that really drives Trump's base is immigration and the wall. But at the same time, the majority of American people do want some sort of national security, or they do see the border as some sort of national security risk in terms of what is happening now at the border. So they do want some sort of border security funding, immigration reform bill passed. So I think Democrats need to show that, look, in good faith, we are not going to pass this $5.7 billion funding for the wall. But at the same time, we want to make sure that we don't look like we're not addressing this. And Democrats need to do, I think, a slightly better job of coming forward and saying, here's the legislation that we're going to put forward that makes it clear that we will address border security. We will put into place measures like, more drones and stronger more border patrol agents at the border, but not necessarily building this concrete wall.
Yeah, could I pick up on that point real quickly?
Casey. Sure.
I agree there. I think that if the offer here is $5.7 billion or some additional dollars for border security, that gives Democrats the protection that they care about it, and then the president signs it into law and simply calls it a wall after the fact. There's no mistake. Let's make no mistake. Whatever gets signed, ultimately, the president's going to say he got his wall. That's where I think if the Democrats soften and the Republicans soften on the terminology here, everybody gets what they want, at least to those who they're messaging to. And it's clear that the president is messaging to his base.
Yeah, and my question here, too, Congressman, is, at what point does the White House start to have a real problem with Republicans in Congress? Because it's pretty clear to me from talking to some of your former colleagues throughout the day yesterday that increasingly Republicans are watching this unfold and saying, what is the exit strategy here? You're putting us in a really tough spot. At the same time, there's not enough of them necessarily to override a presidential veto. So, I mean, how does the White House balance that, and how big of a problem do you think that is for them?
I think it already is a problem. I think they're already having to figure out how to balance it. And I think this week, these are not going to be good votes as a Republican member of Congress to go and vote against a clean appropriations bill to open the IRS or to open up the FDA so that they can accelerate.
That were written in a bipartisan way.
Right. And frankly, you send that bill over to the Senate, and the Senate says we're not going to take it up, even though we already voted for it in the past, because the president's not going to sign it. The president's political operation understands that this is not what you want your Republican members of Congress to have to vote against. And so, to your point, Casey, I think we're already there. I think it's probably still maybe a little bit under the blanket, but there's a lot of movement there, and people, I think, are ready to bust out. I think you're already hearing that from some Republican senators, and I'm sure you're going to have at least a dozen, maybe a couple dozen Republican members vote for it on the floor, because why not? It's going to pass. Why not put up a vote to open up the government?
Maria, there's a lot of talk here this morning and everywhere, every day, about the wall, the border, Republicans, Democrats, potential solution, potential extension of the government shutdown. But what's it like on the ground? What's the mood on the ground where we literally have a series of refugee camps from the state of Texas through San Diego, hundreds, thousands of people at least in these refugee camps?
So I was in El Paso last week, right, and every single front page article was how these individuals are getting released from detention, but haphazardly. If you can imagine, on Christmas Day, individuals, they had over close to 500 individuals in a matter of 3 days that were dropped off at a bus depot without a ticket, with just the clothes on their back, without a place to go. And you have about 22 shelters just alone in El Paso working on text messaging, trying to figure out how to place these mothers and children in safety until they can actually figure out what's the next step. And this is where you recognize that this is a bit of a farce when it comes from the administration, Michael, because if these individuals were truly individuals that we should be afraid of, they would not be released so quickly. They would not have some have ankle bracelets, some don't have ankle bracelets because apparently the Department of Homeland Security just simply runs out of ankle bracelets, and so they release them, and so there's no way to track them again. And these are just notes on the board that recognize that if these individuals are truly harmful or dangerous to the American people, then why are they being released in the middle of Christmas without any other connection to the government after that? So it's questionable.
Certainly not a crisis. Maria Teresa Kumar, thank you so much. Former Congressman Ryan Costello, thank you as well. Up next, a high-ranking military official leaves the administration, while a high-ranking Justice Department official is on the way out. We'll have all that breaking news from overnight when Morning Joe comes right back.